Nathan Hayes knew something was wrong before his daughter said a single word, because 9-year-old Sophie had never been afraid to sit beside him until the afternoon she came home from Northstar's new learning program with both sleeves pulled over her hands. The August heat pressed against the windshield as Nathan drove through suburban Ohio, but Sophie kept her arms folded tightly across her chest, staring out the passenger window while the Northstar app on his phone announced that her first day had been a complete success. Normally, she would have filled the 10-minute drive with every detail, from the color of the classroom walls to what someone had packed for lunch. That day, she only said she was tired. When Nathan reached across at a red light to adjust the seat belt near her shoulder, Sophie flinched so sharply that his hand froze in midair. She immediately apologized, which frightened him more than the reaction itself. Nathan had spent 12 years designing safety systems for Northstar Family Services, and he had learned that people often miss danger because they listened to explanations before trusting what they could see. At home, Sophie went straight to her room and changed into pajamas, even though it was barely 5 o'clock. Nathan found her sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing the long-sleeved shirt she had chosen that morning. He sat beside her without touching her and asked whether anything had happened. Sophie shook her head too quickly. Then one sleeve slipped back as she reached for her stuffed rabbit, and Nathan saw dark marks circling her wrist. His chest tightened. He gently asked to see the other arm. Sophie hesitated, then slowly pushed up both sleeves. The bruises did not require an emergency room, but their shape made a fall difficult to believe. Nathan kept his voice calm, though every instinct inside him demanded answers. Sophie said she had fallen during an exercise. When he asked what kind, she looked toward the hallway, as if someone from the center might be listening. It was a calming exercise, she whispered. Nathan had reviewed every public safety document for the pilot program, and he had never seen that phrase. He photographed the marks for her pediatrician, recorded the time, and opened the Northstar parent portal. Sophie's daily report praised her cooperation, emotional regulation, and successful adjustment. There was no injury note, no incident form, and no mention of any fall. Nathan almost closed the app, assuming the report had been completed before staff noticed the bruises. Then he saw the audit timestamp. The report had been edited at 4:37 p.m., 19 minutes after Sophie left the building. He stared at the screen while Sophie sat silently beside him, twisting the rabbit's ear between her fingers. Someone had changed her record after she was already in his car, and whoever had done it knew exactly what needed to disappear. By 8 the next morning, Nathan understood that Northstar was not trying to explain what had happened to Sophie. It was trying to teach him how dangerous the truth could become. He arrived at the company's regional center before most employees had finished their first coffee, carrying printed screenshots of the altered report, the photographs he had taken, and a list of questions he had rewritten 3 times so his anger would not speak for him. Rebecca Sloan met him in a glass conference room overlooking the therapy wing, dressed in a charcoal suit and wearing the calm expression Northstar executives used during lawsuits, inspections, and television interviews. Caleb Mercer sat beside her with his hands folded, avoiding Nathan's eyes. Rebecca began by saying everyone cared deeply about Sophie, then immediately asked whether the bruises might have occurred at home, during sports, or on the playground before she entered the program. Nathan placed the time-stamped photographs on the table and told her Sophie had been fine that morning. He asked for the original incident report, the unedited behavioral notes, and the hallway camera footage from the final hour of the session. Rebecca's expression barely changed. She said parent access to internal records required legal review, and the cameras in that section had been undergoing a software update. Nathan looked at Caleb. "What is a calming exercise?" he asked. Caleb shifted in his chair and explained that Sophie had become distressed during a transition and that staff had used an approved behavioral stabilization procedure. The phrase sounded rehearsed. Nathan was not a therapist, but he had spent more than a decade reviewing every restraint, de-escalation method, and reporting requirement because his systems were built to enforce them. "That procedure is not in the public safety plan," he said. Rebecca leaned forward and lowered her voice. Northstar, she reminded him, was weeks away from finalizing a federal partnership that could expand services to thousands of children. A misunderstanding, if handled carelessly, could jeopardize jobs, funding, and families across several states. Nathan heard the warning beneath the concern. She was not asking him to wait for facts. She was asking him to weigh his daughter's pain against the company's future. He slid the printed audit log across the table and asked why Sophie's report had been edited after she left. For the first time, Rebecca looked directly at Caleb. Caleb said the update was routine administrative cleanup. Nathan asked what had been removed. Neither of them answered. The silence followed him all the way to the parking lot. At home later that morning, Sophie sat at the kitchen table drawing with colored pencils while Nathan reviewed Northstar's safety manuals again. He asked gently whether anyone had tried to calm her by holding her arms. Her pencils stopped moving. "They said I was making it harder," she whispered. Nathan waited. Sophie kept her eyes on the page. "They told me not to call it holding me down." Nathan felt the room go still. "What did they tell you to call it?" he asked. Sophie finally looked up. Fear and confusion mixed across her face. "A successful reset," she said. Nathan opened the Northstar app and stared at the same phrase in her revised report. It had not been written to describe what happened. It had been written to replace it. Nathan thought the worst thing he could discover was that someone had hurt his daughter, but before noon he realized the company had found a way to make him look responsible instead. He worked from his home office, surrounded by printed policy manuals, archived engineering notes, and technical documentation he had helped write during his 12 years at Northstar Family Services. Every safety procedure, approval chain, and compliance checklist was familiar territory. That was exactly why something felt wrong. The phrase "successful reset" did not exist anywhere in the publicly approved behavioral safety standards. It appeared only in Sophie's revised daily report. Nathan opened the internal engineering portal through a secure employee connection and searched older versions of the documentation. Because he had designed Northstar's original compliance architecture, his credentials still allowed read-only access to archived protocol versions, even though operational teams controlled the current files. After several minutes, he found a restricted operational protocol that had never been included in the public materials distributed to parents or state inspectors. The document described a behavioral stabilization process for pilot programs, but what stopped Nathan cold was the approval page. His own electronic signature appeared at the bottom. He stared at it for several long seconds, unable to breathe. The signature looked authentic, the timestamp dated back nearly 18 months, and the document displayed his employee identification number exactly as it should have. Yet he had no memory of reviewing or approving anything remotely similar. The approval was not a scanned signature. It carried the digital certificate Northstar had issued to him, a credential that should have required his physical security key. Nathan immediately checked his archive calendar from that week. According to his records, he had spent 3 consecutive days attending a federal transportation safety conference in Denver, more than 1,000 miles from Northstar headquarters. The approval time listed on the protocol fell in the middle of one of his conference presentations. He opened his airline confirmations, hotel invoices, travel receipts, and conference agenda. Everything confirmed the same fact. He could not have participated in the approval meeting described in the document. His concern shifted from confusion to something much darker. If someone had copied his authorization once, how many other documents carried his name? Before he could continue searching, his company laptop displayed an incoming meeting request marked mandatory executive review. Less than an hour later, Nathan sat across from Rebecca Sloan and 2 human resources officials in another glass conference room. Rebecca spoke calmly, almost sympathetically, explaining that recent questions surrounding the pilot program required an internal administrative review. She informed Nathan that his system access would be temporarily suspended while compliance officers examined historical approvals connected to the behavioral initiative. Nathan asked whether the review had anything to do with Sophie. Rebecca answered that the matters were separate. Nathan knew they were not. He placed the printed protocol on the table and pointed directly to his electronic signature. "I never approved this," he said. Rebecca looked at the page only briefly before sliding it back toward him. "Our records indicate otherwise," she replied. One of the HR managers quietly collected Nathan's security badge, company laptop, and employee access card. In less than 5 minutes, 12 years of trust disappeared into a cardboard evidence envelope. Nathan walked through the lobby while coworkers looked away, uncertain whether they were witnessing an honest employee caught in a misunderstanding or a respected engineer exposed for hiding dangerous decisions. As the elevator doors closed, Nathan's phone vibrated with a message from an unknown sender. There was no greeting, no signature, only a single sentence. They are preparing to blame you before anyone asks what happened to your daughter. By the time Nathan reached home, Northstar had already begun turning his daughter's bruises into evidence against him. His employee profile had disappeared from the company directory, his access to internal records was gone, and a carefully worded email had been sent to senior staff announcing that he was under review for possible failures in the pilot program's approval process. The message never mentioned Sophie. It never mentioned the altered report. It simply suggested that Nathan's own decisions might have placed children at risk. He read it twice at the kitchen counter while Sophie sat nearby, slowly pushing peas around her lunch plate. She had heard enough of his phone calls to understand that something was wrong, but not enough to know why. "Are you in trouble because of me?" she asked. Nathan set the phone face down. The question struck harder than anything Rebecca had said. He moved to the chair beside her and told her none of this was her fault, but Sophie kept her eyes lowered. Earlier that day, another child from the program had sent her a message saying his mother had heard that Sophie's father designed the procedure everyone was talking about. Sophie had deleted it before Nathan could see it, but the words had already settled inside her. She believed that by telling the truth, she had damaged his job, his reputation, and the only stable life they had left after her mother's death. Nathan wanted a promise that everything would be fixed, yet he no longer knew how much power Northstar had over the story. The anonymous warning remained on his phone, unanswered. Then, shortly after 1 that afternoon, a second message arrived with an address and 3 words: "Come alone, please." Nathan arranged for Sophie to stay with a trusted neighbor, then drove 11 miles to a 24-hour diner near the interstate, where he found Emily Carter waiting in a booth beneath a flickering light. She was one of Northstar's behavioral therapists, a quiet woman Nathan had seen in meetings but barely knew. Her coffee had gone cold, and she kept glancing toward the windows. Emily admitted she had sent the messages. She told Nathan that staff had been pressured for months to make the pilot program's outcomes look stronger than they were. Children who cried, resisted, or asked to leave were recorded as having completed successful regulation cycles. Injuries were rewritten as minor adjustment responses. Reports that could trigger state review were delayed, softened, or removed. Nathan asked why she had waited until now. Emily's expression tightened with shame. She said she had convinced herself the problems were temporary and that speaking up would only close a program many families depended on. Then Sophie came in. Emily had seen the marks on her wrists and watched Caleb order the incident note replaced with approved language. "Your daughter is not the first child they hurt," she said, "but she may be the first one whose father understands the system well enough to prove it." Nathan felt the booth narrow around him. Emily opened a folder and showed him a list of altered case numbers. One belonged to Sophie. Another had no name, only an age, a date, and the word transferred. Nathan asked what had happened to that child. Emily looked toward the nearly empty parking lot before answering. "The injury was worse," she whispered, and by the next morning, the entire file was gone. The missing child's file did not prove Northstar had made a mistake. It proved someone had built a system where mistakes could be erased before anyone outside the company knew they existed. Emily slid the folder across the diner table and showed Nathan how the altered case numbers followed the same pattern. A child became distressed. Staff used the unlisted stabilization procedure. An injury note appeared in the system, and within hours the language changed. Words like restrained, bruised, and frightened were replaced with regulated, redirected, and successfully reset. The original reports were not corrected. They were overwritten. Nathan studied the timestamps and noticed that most edits occurred shortly before Northstar presented monthly performance results to investors and school partners. The program's success rate always climbed after the records changed. 2 percentage points 1 month for the next, then nearly 11 before the company announced plans to expand nationwide. What had happened to Sophie was not simply being hidden. It was being converted into evidence that the program worked. Emily told him therapists were given weekly targets for emotional improvement, even though children did not recover according to corporate schedules. When the numbers fell short, supervisors pressured staff to reclassify distress as progress. Children who stopped resisting after being held were marked as calm. Parents were told their sons and daughters had adapted beautifully. Meanwhile, Rebecca Sloan used those results to negotiate the sale of Northstar's pilot division to Meridian Health Group, a national company preparing an offer worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Nathan felt the full shape of the scheme settle over him. The bruises on Sophie's wrists were connected to a deal large enough to make executives rich, and a stolen signature had been placed beneath the policy that made it possible. "They're not just protecting the program," he said. "They're protecting the sale." Emily nodded. She then played a recording from a staff meeting she had captured 2 weeks earlier. Caleb Mercer's voice came first, tense and unsteady, warning that another serious complaint could force them to suspend the pilot. Rebecca answered with chilling calm. She said there would be no more formal complaints because every report would be routed through executive review. Caleb argued that the restraint protocol had never been properly authorized. Rebecca replied that the authorization already existed and that Nathan Hayes had signed it. Nathan gripped the edge of the table. Then Caleb said something that made the diner feel suddenly colder. He told Rebecca that Nathan would know the signature was false. Rebecca did not deny it. She said Nathan was emotionally compromised, had direct access to the system, and could be presented as the engineer who approved the procedure and then panicked when his own daughter was affected. "He will look like a father trying to save himself," she said, "not a whistleblower trying to save anyone else." The recording ended. For several seconds, Nathan heard only the low hum of the diner refrigerator and a distant rush of trucks on the interstate. Emily said Caleb had wanted to stop the program, but Rebecca had threatened to make him the next person blamed. Nathan looked down at Sophie's case number, then at the missing child's file, and understood that Northstar had already chosen its version of the truth. If he failed to move quickly, the company would complete the sale, the records would disappear, and his name would become the shield protecting everyone responsible. Then Emily reached into her bag and placed one final document on the table. It was a system migration notice scheduled to begin at 6 that evening. Every original behavioral record in the pilot program was about to be compressed, transferred, and permanently removed from the active server. With less than 4 hours before Northstar erased the original records, the only witness Nathan trusted was a frightened 9-year-old who believed the company could hear her through the walls. He returned home and found Sophie curled beneath her mother's old blue quilt on the living room couch, the stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. Nathan stood in the doorway, watching her breathe, and felt the weight of every choice waiting for him. If he pushed too hard, he could deepen the fear she was already carrying. If he stayed silent, Northstar would destroy the evidence and continue doing the same thing to other children. He sat beside her, turned off every phone in the house, and told her she did not have to explain anything she was not ready to remember. He only asked her to draw the room where the calming exercise had happened. At first, Sophie stared at the blank paper. Then she picked up a gray pencil and sketched a narrow room with no windows, a chair against one wall, and a small black circle near the ceiling. Nathan asked what the circle was. "The blinking light," she said. Caleb told them it wasn't recording, but the red lights stayed on. Nathan's pulse quickened. The company had claimed the hallway cameras were unavailable, but Sophie had just described an interior observation camera that was not listed on the public floor plan. She added a cabinet beside the door and drew a white label across it. Nathan asked whether she remembered the words. Sophie slowly wrote 3 letters, E-A-R, then she stopped. "Emergency Archive Recorder," Nathan whispered. Years earlier, when he helped design Northstar's safety infrastructure, state regulators had required an independent backup system for high-risk therapy rooms. The archive was built to preserve footage and sensor logs, even if the main server failed or records were altered. Because the backup was legally separated from routine company data, It could not be accessed through the standard employee portal. Nathan had nearly forgotten about it because the system was rarely used and maintained by an outside compliance vendor. More importantly, the scheduled migration would not erase it. He called Emily and asked whether Northstar still used the original archive hardware. She said she had seen technicians inspect a locked equipment room in the basement 2 months earlier. Nathan opened an old engineering binder from his garage and found the vendor contract. The archive transmitted encrypted copies to an off-site data center every 6 hours, but access required either a state investigator's emergency authorization or 2 separate internal security credentials. Nathan's credential had been suspended. Emily's had never included archive access. For a moment, the solution seemed close enough to touch and still impossible to reach. Then Sophie pointed to the drawing again. "The person with the silver badge opened the cabinet," she said. Nathan asked who she meant. Sophie explained that after she began crying, someone she had never seen before entered the room, checked the recorder, and quietly argued with Caleb in the hallway. She remembered the silver badge because it had the shape of Ohio stamped into it. Nathan realized the program had already been observed by an outside official. Emily searched her calendar and found a name attached to an unannounced compliance visit 3 weeks earlier. Alicia Monroe, an investigator with the state's Child Services Oversight Division. Nathan called the number listed on the report. Alicia answered on the 4th ring. He told her about Sophie, the forged approval, and the 6 o'clock deletion. She remained silent until he mentioned the emergency archive recorder. Then her voice changed. "Do not contact Northstar again," she said. "Do not warn them that you know the backup exists." Nathan looked at the clock. It was 2:14 p.m. Because the allegation involved injured children, imminent destruction of regulated records, and a state-mandated archive, Alicia could seek an emergency administrative preservation order without waiting for a full court hearing. She said the process might still take several hours. Before ending the call, she asked one final question. "Mr. Hayes, are you certain the archive is still connected?" Nathan looked at Sophie's drawing of the blinking red light. "It was connected yesterday," he said. Alicia exhaled sharply. "Then we may still have time," she replied, "unless someone inside Northstar realizes your daughter remembered it first." At 5:43 p.m., with only 17 minutes left before Northstar servers were scheduled to erase the past, Nathan watched a single blinking progress bar determine whether the truth would survive the day. Alicia Monroe had secured an emergency preservation order, forcing Northstar to grant immediate access to the independent emergency archive recorder under state authority. Nathan met Alicia and Emily outside the locked compliance annex behind the main campus, where 2 state technology specialists were already waiting with sealed evidence cases. Rebecca Sloan arrived moments later with Northstar's legal counsel, insisting the migration was routine and warning that interrupting it could damage sensitive patient records. Alicia calmly handed her the signed preservation order and informed her that any attempt to interfere with the archive could constitute obstruction of a state investigation. Rebecca said nothing more, but the confidence that had defined every previous conversation was beginning to crack. Inside the equipment room, rows of aging servers hummed beneath dim fluorescent lights, dust-covered hardware that most employees no longer remembered existed. One technician connected a forensic workstation while another verified the archive's integrity. Nathan stood silently beside Emily, staring at the monitor as encrypted directories slowly appeared. Then the first recovered file opened. It contained synchronized video, audio, sensor logs, and the original incident report from Sophie's session. The report was nothing like the revised version stored in Northstar's active system. It documented that Sophie had become frightened after being separated from another child, that staff had continued the intervention despite visible distress, and that bruising was observed immediately afterward. The original author recommended notifying Nathan before pickup and filing a mandatory incident report with state oversight. Neither action had occurred. Instead, the archive recorded a second login 27 minutes later. Caleb Mercer entered the record, hesitated for nearly 40 seconds, then transferred editing authority to Rebecca Sloan's executive account. Rebecca removed every reference to bruising, replaced the recommendation with the phrase "successful reset," and approved the final version through an executive override that reactivated Nathan Hayes' digital certificate. Nathan closed his eyes for a moment. He had expected manipulation, but seeing every step unfold in chronological order left no room for doubt. Alicia instructed the technicians to duplicate the archive immediately. As additional files were recovered, the pattern became overwhelming. Dozens of children had original reports that differed dramatically from the records their parents received. Some incidents involved emotional distress. Others documented injuries requiring medical evaluation. Yet nearly every case ended with identical language praising successful adjustment and positive outcomes. One recovered file matched the anonymous case Emily had shown Nathan at the diner. The child had been transferred to a hospital after the incident, while the report given to the family claimed the session had ended without injury. Emily quietly covered her mouth as names she recognized continued scrolling across the screen. The archive did not contain Northstar's executive emails, but its audit trail identified Rebecca's account, the exact edit times, and the internal server paths used to authorize the changes. Alicia used that evidence to expand the preservation order to Northstar's executive communication system. Minutes later, the forensic team recovered a draft acquisition presentation prepared for Meridian Health Group. One slide celebrated a 98% behavioral success rate and highlighted Nathan Hayes as the lead engineer responsible for the safety framework supporting the pilot program. Attached beneath the presentation was a note from Rebecca Sloan to senior leadership. It read, "Once migration is complete, legacy inconsistencies will no longer present acquisition risk." The room fell silent. Northstar had not been preserving history. It had been manufacturing it. Alicia sealed the copied drives into evidence bags and informed everyone present that the investigation was now under formal state authority. Rebecca reached for her phone, but one of the investigators instructed her to place it on the table. At 6 o'clock, the automated migration sequence activated, but the state technicians had already isolated the servers and captured verified forensic images of every original file. Northstar's system attempted to overwrite the records exactly as Emily had warned, creating one final piece of evidence, proof that the deletion had been scheduled before the investigation began. Northstar did not collapse because one father raised his voice. It collapsed because every institution the company had deceived finally heard the truth at the same time. The moment the archive was secured, Alicia Monroe issued an emergency suspension of the pilot program and ordered every Northstar facility in Ohio to stop using the disputed behavioral procedure. State investigators entered the regional center with evidence warrants. Meridian Health Group froze the acquisition and demanded access to all compliance records. Nathan watched the consequences unfold from a private room at the state office, while Sophie stayed safely with a neighbor he trusted. Television helicopters circled the Northstar campus, and reporters crowded the sidewalk where employees once entered beneath banners promising safer futures for children. Northstar's largest school district partner suspended its contract. 2 insurance providers suspended coverage pending investigation. The company's lenders restricted access to a critical line of credit after Meridian released a statement saying the behavioral success data could not be trusted. Rebecca Sloan attempted to reassure investors during an emergency video call, but Alicia's office confirmed that investigators had recovered original records showing systematic alteration of incident reports. The call ended before Rebecca finished speaking. Northstar's board placed her on administrative leave. Caleb Mercer surrendered his company devices and agreed to cooperate, providing investigators with emails, meeting notes, and the names of executives who had approved the reporting strategy. Emily Carter gave a recorded statement that continued late into the evening. Parents began gathering outside Northstar facilities, carrying photographs, medical records, and reports they had once accepted as complete. Some had spent months believing their children's fear meant they were failing to adjust. Others had blamed themselves for injuries Northstar described as ordinary behavioral responses. Now they stood together, realizing the same language had been used to silence every family separately. Nathan provided his formal testimony the following afternoon. As investigators guided Rebecca past him in the hallway, she slowed just long enough to say the company had served thousands of families and that he was destroying everything because of one difficult day. Nathan looked through the glass wall at Emily, Alicia, and boxes filled with recovered records. "No," he replied. "You destroyed it every time you decided a child's pain was less valuable than your numbers." An investigator immediately moved between them and continued escorting her down the hall. By late afternoon, less than 24 hours after Nathan first documented Sophie's bruises, Northstar's board announced the suspension of all clinical operations, Meridian's withdrawal from the acquisition process, and the resignation of the company's chief executive team. Northstar's government contracts were placed under review, its lenders suspended access to emergency financing, and its license to operate child treatment programs was temporarily revoked. Nathan expected victory to feel louder. Instead, he returned home to find Sophie beneath her mother's blue quilt, waiting for him on the couch. She studied his face as he sat beside her. "Did they believe us?" she asked. Nathan took her hand without touching the fading marks on her wrist. "They cannot hide from you anymore," he said. Sophie leaned against him, and for the first time since her first day at Northstar, she did not flinch. The company offered Nathan enough money to rebuild his entire life, but accepting it would have required him to pretend Sophie's pain had a price. 6 weeks after Northstar suspended operations, a courier delivered a confidential settlement proposal to Nathan's attorney. The offer included several $1 million, payment of Sophie's future medical and educational expenses, restoration of Nathan's professional reputation, and a written statement claiming the forged approval had resulted from an administrative error. In return, Nathan would withdraw his civil complaint, return any confidential company materials still lawfully in his possession, and agree never to speak publicly about the pilot program. The agreement could not touch evidence already held by investigators, but it would prevent Nathan from helping families understand what the records showed. The document was nearly 80 pages long, but Nathan found the truth in one sentence buried near the end. Northstar admitted no wrongdoing. He read the proposal at his kitchen table while Sophie worked on a school project across from him. The bruises on her wrists had faded, yet she still avoided rooms with locked doors and sometimes woke at night asking whether the blinking red light was watching her. No amount of money could make those memories harmless, and no private agreement could protect the next child from a system built on silence. Nathan rejected the offer the following morning. His attorney warned that the legal process could last years and that refusing guaranteed money carried real risk. Nathan understood. He also understood that Sophie had already risked more simply by telling the truth. Rejecting the money did not bring immediate peace. It brought depositions, hearings, sleepless nights, and months in which Sophie had to learn that justice moved more slowly than fear. The state investigation expanded across 3 states, and federal regulators began reviewing every contract tied to Northstar's behavioral data. Rebecca Sloan was charged with falsifying records, obstructing oversight, and conspiring to defraud investors and government partners. Caleb Mercer avoided the most serious charges by cooperating, but he lost his license and admitted under oath that fear had not merely kept him silent. It had led him to participate in edits he knew were deceptive. Emily Carter became the lead witness in the case, and later helped investigators contact dozens of families whose reports had been altered, including the mother of the child whose entire file had vanished. Nathan's stolen authorization was formally invalidated, and an independent review cleared him of every allegation. When reporters asked whether he planned to return to corporate risk management, he said he was not ready. Instead, he joined Alicia Monroe and a panel of parents, therapists, and child advocates to design new statewide protections. High-risk therapy rooms would now require continuously monitored independent archives. Parents would receive original incident reports before any executive review. No single employee could alter behavioral records without preserving the previous version, Children would be interviewed by an outside specialist whenever unexplained injuries appeared, and the phrase successful reset was removed from state-approved reporting standards. The reforms could not undo what had happened, but they made secrecy harder and accountability unavoidable. Months later, Nathan drove Sophie to her first day at a new school. She wore a yellow backpack and carried her stuffed rabbit inside it, hidden beneath her notebooks. When they reached the entrance, she stopped and stared at the glass doors. Nathan told her they could go home if she was not ready. Sophie took a slow breath, then reached for his hand. This time, Sophie was the one who reached first. "Can you walk me to the classroom?" she asked. Nathan smiled and said he would walk as far as she needed. Inside, her new teacher greeted her gently and left the classroom door open. Sophie checked the doorway once before. Taking her seat, Nathan raised his hand in a small wave, and she waved back. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no executives waiting to control what happened next. Just a father standing in a quiet hallway, watching his daughter choose courage on her own terms. Nathan had started the fight, believing he needed to save Sophie. In the end, her voice had saved families he would never meet, changed safeguards that would outlive them both, and reminded him that justice was not the moment a powerful company fell. Justice was the moment a frightened child finally understood that telling the truth had not broken her world. It had opened the door to a safer one.